Yo, what's up, everybody? Today is May 31st, 2025. Bonus episode for Real Sankara Hours. Yeah, it's me, Adam, and
And
Pete.
Peter MGunn.
Yeah, we're here, and yeah, let's just get into it. There's a lot of stuff happening. I have a shit ton of thoughts about Africa.
Yeah,
And
we're getting back to the basics on this one.
yeah, especially the spirit of this podcast will, in the ideology is Pan-Africanism, and yeah, I have a shit ton of thoughts. So trying to think of like how to set this up. Like I'm just spitballing. Well, there's a ton of stuff going on in the Sahel region, with basically Ibrahim Traore, the leader of Burkina Faso, who many compare to the namesake of this podcast, Thomas Sankara. I think he's awesome. Like I like the guy. He's fucking cool.
You gotta respect him, and it is just like he's engaged like young people, and just like even like black people in America are like paying attention in a way that just does not get traction normally with this kind of stuff. So there's definitely something going on.
Yeah, and actually, I'll just Peter, you and I were talking. I was telling you about this book I just read, and since this is the bonus episode, it'd be a good place to share this, especially because on bonus episodes we like to do readings on political theory and like share any books we've read. The book that I just finished reading a couple days ago. Hold on, let me get it. It's okay. I have it right here. It's by Jeremy Keenan. He's a professorial research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And yeah, he's been a consultant on the Sahara and the Sahel for numerous international organizations, including the UN, the European Commission, and many others. So Jeremy Keenan is an expert on the Sahel region. I believe his training is I think his formal training is as a social anthropologist, I believe. Anyway, the book is called The Dying Sahara, U.S. Imperialism and Terror in Africa. There's another book he wrote called The Dark Sahara. This book, The Dying Sahara, it was published, let me get the year. I believe it was like, what was it? I'm looking through the book. Oh, it's first published in 2013, so 12 years ago. So when I finished reading the book, toward the end, a lot of it was talking about the then current situation in the Sahel region. So there are some things that were out of date. But for anyone who remembers, and again, I don't know exactly the age demographic of our patrons, but it's something I try to think about because as a 37-year-old millennial, I'm realizing there are a lot of younger leftists like Gen Zoomers and like basically tail end of millennial to the beginning of Generation Z. So I say that because if you're perhaps like Generation Z, when NATO intervened in Libya, you were probably still in K through 12. So I don't know how much, if you're a Zoomer, like how much you were paying attention to Libya and NATO and the Arab Spring and all that type of stuff. But basically, yeah, there's the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and it spread to Libya. There was an uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, but there were these, particularly, people were saying that like Gaddafi was threatening to genocide people, I believe, in further west in Libya. So that was a justification for the NATO intervention in Libya. That like there is
Hillary Clinton's baby.
Yeah, there is like an imminent threat of genocide. Meanwhile, compare that to an actual genocide going on in Gaza committed by Israel at the behest of the U.S. There's been like no military intervention, even though like everyone can see that this genocide is happening in broad daylight and being broadcast throughout social media. Anyway, so NATO intervened in Libya, toppled Gaddafi, and there was a major fallout from that. Basically, like Libya kind of became a failed state. There was like a lot of civil war, like just chaos in Libya, a resurrection of the slave trade in Libya, which I think is still going on. But anyway, the fallout was, to give people some perspective, and this will lead up to the book. So the Sahara and the Sahel region, right? So if you look at a map of Africa, you guys, those of you who support us and listen to us, I assume that you're more educated than the typical American on geography, but a lot of Americans think Africa is a country when it's not. It's a continent. So if you look at a map, the geography of Africa, so you see in the north, right, the countries of Morocco, which is right below Spain, and then you get to Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, then Egypt, then you go further east, and to Egypt's eastern border is the Gaza Strip and Israel, right? So then you go further south. South of Egypt is Sudan, and then you get to countries like Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, right? So, and then you go further south below the Sahara, you get to like south of Niger is Nigeria, south of, you'll further south from Mali, countries like Ivory Coast, and then I believe like Mali, then Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Togo, Benin, etc., etc. So when people talk about African people, the term sub-Saharan gets used quite a bit. So that term is kind of a colonial term, so I personally try not to say sub-Saharan African because, like, people use sub-Saharan as, like, a racial term. That, like, essentially, Black Africa is sub-Saharan, and then North Africa is, like, a little different. When it's a little more complex than that, because you have some people who are technically racially black in North Africa, and then there are plenty of North Africans who are not racially black. So there are Arabs in North Africa. The spread of Islam Arabized North Africa, but the indigenous peoples of North Africa are the Amazigh people. And many of them, if you look at a lot of Amazigh people in Northern Africa, they don't look black. They don't look fully white either. Some of them, because I've met some people who are, North African, like non-black, but like they don't look white, but they're not black. So, but then you have black people in Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, and then further south, right? So the Sahara Desert, then there's like the Sahel. So southern Algeria and then northern Mali share a border. So southern Algeria shares a border with Niger and Mali, and there's a group of people called the Tuareg. The Tuareg people are, they're a nomadic ethnic group. So they're like a large, like kind of Amazigh ethnic group who are traditionally nomadic pastoralists. And they're found in countries like southern Algeria, southwestern Libya, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, with small communities in like Chad, Sudan, and northern Nigeria. But
they make some great rock music.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Thank you for saying that, Peter. Yeah, it actually to kind of connect it. If you read the book Africa and the Blues, right? African American blues music. The music actually does trace back to West Africa. So like again, looking at a map of Africa, like kind of like the Mali, Senegal, Gambia region, right? Like there's that whole Sahara Desert stretches from obviously like southern Egypt and northern Sudan all the way to Mauritania, right? And then the Sahel is basically like it's a region of Africa. So it's like Wikipedia calls it a biogeographical region of Africa. It's a transition zone. There you go. From like I'm kind of reading a little bit from Wikipedia, between the more humid Sudanian savannas to the south and the drier Sahara to the north. So it's almost like a belt geographically. Like if you were to Google Sahel region, right, it would go from like northeastern Sudan and a little bit of Eritrea and then stretches across to Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, and like northern Senegal. Okay, so that's the Sahel region. And yeah, it is like kind of a transition point between like much of North Africa and then below the Sahara, right? So, and the Tuareg people are nomadic, and believe historically they had access to like trade routes in the desert, right? So like before the transatlantic slave trade, like Africa was for the most part kind of cut off from much of the world because of the desert, right? Like people who were not indigenous to Africa, like they'd be fucking caught dead trying to cross the Sahara Desert because it's just all desert. Like if you can't like not a lot of people could survive in the desert without like water, but the Tuaregs, who again are nomadic, they kind of traditionally like were sort of like tradespeople who would like trade the trans-Sahara trade between like North Africa and below the Sahara. Like they had like access to trade routes, right? So anyway, with that context, so the aftermath of the NATO intervention in Libya was started in 2011. I believe, if I remember correctly. Let me get my facts correct, because Gaddafi, was he? Oh, okay, I remember. All right, I just googled it. Yeah, so yeah, the people said like, oh, Gaddafi has like mercenaries during that time in 2011. So some of the Tuaregs were joined like mercenary groups in Libya fighting, but the Tuaregs they've long had their own political interest, which was to essentially establish essentially like a nation of their own. Like a lot of, there are a lot of ethnic groups in different parts of the world who have nationalistic aspirations, especially if they are stateless. So
and they were not considered in the Berlin Conference because we're still using those lines.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Thanks, Peter. Yeah. Especially when because again, like the borders of Africa were drawn up during the Berlin Conference, right? So their interests were not considered. So you can kind of think of the Tuareg like a stateless people, kind of like the Kurds in the Middle East. So like the Kurdish people are like in northern Iraq, Syria, I believe parts of like eastern Turkey. The Tuareg are kind of similar. Anyway, the aftermath of the war in Libya basically for them is like an opportunity to push for their own nationalistic aspirations. So with that context, with Jeremy Keenan's book, The Dying Sahara, essentially his thesis in the book, and he has another book which I got, which I haven't read yet, but I literally just finished this book, and it's pretty dense. The guy really knows what the hell he's talking about. But there's a lot of like moving parts when it comes to the Sahel and Africa that to understand what he's talking about, you're going to have to know it. So this is for anyone who like is curious about reading the book. This is why I'm kind of laying out the context. Essentially, after the War on Terror, like right after 9/11, in the beginning of the War on Terror, Algeria became an ally with the U.S. when it came to the War on Terror. And again, southern Algeria is where a lot of Tuareg people are, and Algeria has long had a quote unquote Tuareg problem, because again of their own nationalistic aspirations. And in the Sahel region, it's also pretty resource rich, just like a lot of Africa. So uranium in Niger. So anyone who remembers the Iraq War, the quote unquote uranium that Saddam Hussein was getting uranium cakes in Niger.
The yellow cake.
Yeah, the yellow cake, like, which was complete bullshit. But what is true is that that region, particularly Niger, the country, has uranium. Now, uranium, you need that to create nuclear weapons and nuclear power. So France has its own economic interests in West Africa, stemming from its colonization of Africa after the Berlin Conference. But there's a lot of natural resources that France needs in West Africa, which ties into the current situation in the Sahel with leaders like Traore basically kicking French troops out. Like, France needs, access to uranium in West Africa to power their nuclear power plants. So that region is resource rich. Natural gas, oil, uranium, stuff like that. And the Tuareg people, their land is sitting on top of it, basically. What the Tuareg people consider like their kind of like their land, which they would call I believe it's Azawad. So yeah, the traditional distribution of the Tuareg people are like, again, southwestern Libya, southern Algeria, northern Mali, northern Niger, and parts of like northern Burkina Faso. Anyway, so what his book shows, and there's actually an article from Nafiz Ahmed that says something similar, that essentially Algeria's deep state, it was called the DRS. By the way, the agency DRS in Algeria, it was actually dissolved in 2016. So that is where the book is out of date, because the book was published in 2013. In 2016, Algeria dissolved it. But Algeria's DRS, and I'll find the acronym of what Algeria DRS stands for. I believe it's Department of Intelligence and Security. In the DRS, it stems from a French acronym, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Anyway, but the English translation is Department of Intelligence and Security. And in 2016, it was dissolved by Abdelaziz Bouteflika. And it was replaced by another security agency that answers more directly to the president. Anyway, imagine Algeria's DRS kind of like the Pakistani ISI, Israel's Mossad, kind of like that, right? Kind of very shady spy agency. A lot of intelligence agencies are like pretty shady, including the CIA, right? So this is Algeria. That was Algeria's equivalent. They kind of, what Keenan spells out is like, they kind of ran amok and did their own shit, and they often had like a little bit more influence than the president, which I think is why the agency was dissolved. Anyway, Algeria's DRS, one of the dirty things it did in the 2010s, the 2000s, the 2010s, was essentially train and support al-Qaeda operatives in the Sahel region. So AQIM, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Magreb, what he spells out is essentially that a lot of members of AQIM had ties to the Algerian deep state. Now, why the fuck? Now, the question is, to you listeners would probably be, why the fuck is the Algerian deep state supporting al-Qaeda? Especially right after 9/11, right? You would think they'd want to get rid of al-Qaeda, but no, they're supporting it. Why? Well, basically, it was essentially an excuse to blame terrorism on the Tuareg people. That was basically the idea. So like he basically lays out like a series of kidnappings of like particularly Western tourists from like Europe, kidnappings and terrorist attacks, they would try to blame it on the Tuareg, but it turns out the people who actually did those attacks were members of al-Qaeda, or they're members of AQIM and had ties to Algeria's deep state. So, and now the next question would be, did the West know about that? Did the West know that the Algerian deep state was supporting al-Qaeda and terrorism in the Sahel? The answer is yes, they did. But at the same time, like the idea was to have essentially like an ally in North Africa to basically like the war on terror. Essentially, it's kind of like how, you know, the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan and like the dirty shit that the ISI would do, essentially. So, so yeah, that's what the book lays out, and it definitely, I found the book helpful to understand like what the hell's going on in the Sahel, because, you know, like a lot of like the quote unquote idea of you know, terrorism and stuff like that. When you look at the history, you'll find like Western interests having their dirty hands in it, especially like with, you know, that people use the term false flag terrorism, and they say like, oh, if you say that, you're like a conspiracy nut. But like, false flag terrorism is a real thing. Like, even the FBI would like do these shady ass sting operations where they would essentially like try to coax someone into doing a terrorist attack and then like arrest them and be like, hey, we're fighting terrorism, even though like the person doing that was like coaxed into like there'd be like an undercover FBI agent who'd be like, try to egg on some, like, I don't know, some poor innocent Muslim guy and be like, yeah, man, we should just get some bombs and shit and blow up America. And like, essentially, yeah, like these are tactics that intelligence agencies have done to basically like justify their state repression and whatever militaristic interest they have, or whatever interest they have. Like, they will essentially do false flag terrorism attacks as a justification to expand their longer term interest. And so, for the U.S. supporting Algeria as an ally, the idea was to expand AFRICOM in Africa. So,
dun dun dun.
Yeah, so I thought the book was really good. I'm gonna be honest, it took me a while to get through it. Like I said, it's a dense book. It's not super long. Let me see. It's 282 pages of actual like the book itself. 282 pages, which technically isn't long. Although, however, given how much people are addicted to screens and social media, like 282 pages seems like probably hell on earth to read for a lot of people, especially something as dense as like the Algerian deep state, Tuareg rebellions, terrorism, and Western imperialism, and like there's a lot of dense stuff in this book. So it took me some time to read it, because I was also reading other books too. Like I have a shit ton of books that I love reading and I like going through, and I appreciate reading even more now that like everyone's addicted to fucking screens. And so it's nice to kind of sit down, read a book, feed your mind, become aware of the world. Anyway, so I wanted to share that, especially in context of what's going on in the Sahel, which is like, you know, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are basically cutting ties with France. And
ECOWAS. I don't know when we're gonna get them in there, but
yeah, and ECOWAS, they're cutting ties with, because like ECOWAS is I'm not a super expert on ECOWAS, but like from what I know of the leaders of ECOWAS, they're much more conciliatory with the West.
Yeah, it's I think it's the Economic Cooperation of West African States, but
yeah,
they're usually sort of the regional group that will, yes, cooperate with the U.S. or France, or whenever something flares up, they're the ones to like organize the intervention and basically, keep all the resources flowing. So it's they're organizing Traore, like they're organizing a rival power block, kind of, I think, the same way that Chavez did in Latin America. Like there's the Organization of American States, that's like the regional Latin American group that basically is there for the U.S. to tell everyone what to do. But Chavez created the ALBA to create a different group that without the U.S. So it's basically a rival power block.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, sorry. And actually, so ECOWAS, the acronym, it's Economic Community of West African States, and the countries in ECOWAS are, the member states are Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau. I'm looking at the map. Apparently, Guinea is a suspended member. Cape Verde, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. Let's see, I'm just quickly. And in 2024, so last year, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, they withdrew from the bloc. And they were suspended, actually, because basically, what happened is, leaders like Traore in Burkina Faso, they took power through a military coup. And so they got suspended as a result of that. And their bloc is the Alliance of Sahel States. And the end goal of the Alliance of Sahel States is a goal of establishing essentially a federation. And part of the beef, particularly that leaders like Traore have, because Traore, he's a soldier. So actually, this is an interesting fact. I looked up Ibrahim Traore's birthday. He is only 3 days older than me. We're both 37. He's just 3 days older than me. So, almost a semi-birthday twin. But yeah, he's of a generation of African soldiers and young leaders who, there's comparisons to him with Sankara essentially because of his very nationalistic and populist approach, and he's a very charismatic leader, I think. One thing that Burkina Faso has done under him that I think, Peter, you were mentioning about how much he's galvanized the African diaspora. Burkina Faso is putting on the table citizenship for the African diaspora. So basically, I still need to look at the details of all that, but one thing I did read is that I believe it's if you go through the African Diaspora Development Initiative or something like that, the ADDI, I have to double check. But that's where I found that Burkina Faso has put on the table citizenship for the African diaspora. So there's basically people of African descent outside of Africa, which would include Black Americans. And when people criticize, say Pan-Africanism is this pie in the sky idea, look, to all the kind of, I don't want to harp on FBA ADOS on this podcast, but I think that movement, it obviously has not gained any real political traction. It's just a bunch of just Tariq Nasheed stands just yelling on the internet about they don't want to be African or whatever the fuck. But they haven't achieved anything that movement. They ostensibly they were about reparations for Black Americans, but mostly it's been about just them starting petty beefs with Black immigrants, and it's dumb as shit. It's politically immature and incredibly stupid. But the main point I brought that up is because they haven't gotten that whole FBA ADOS thing hasn't really achieved anything politically. Meanwhile, Um, Burkina Faso is putting on the table citizenship for the African diaspora, and especially mention that. Think of that in the context of what's going on in the U.S. because I actually do think that. Actually, I'd like to know your thoughts on this, Peter. Like, I do notice like there is some real Black American fatigue with politics, especially after Trump, because I do think like there is some uh disappointment among some Black Americans that like once again we're the ones who tried to save the country from fascism, basically beyond just like voting. But like I do think the election results like there's some kind of a sharp political difference between Black Americans and other demographics in that like I do think that Trump made the largest inroads in increase in support with well particularly young men, but like a lot of other demographics. But meanwhile, like with Black Americans, there's a little bit of increase in support, but by and large, both Black women and Black men, the vast majority voted for Kamala Harris. And even the Black men who didn't vote for Harris, like there are more Black men whose politics are probably closer to ours, like in terms of further left, who just didn't vote for Harris because of like the genocide in Gaza. But like I mentioned that like because I do think that there's some like kind of frustration among Black Americans with building coalitions, and just like what, like fuck this, we're not going to do anything anymore. Like we try, it's basically like we tried to warn you, you didn't want to listen to us, and we're just not going to do shit. And I think the sentiment, I'm not saying that the apathy is good, but I think it's understandable. But I'm thinking about that in the context of the U.S., like while Black Americans are feeling that way, there is this opportunity, I think, to embolden like Pan-Africanism and basically like, okay, if the politics of Black America is like, what, like we're sick of politics in America. For me, I would argue like, okay, well, why don't Black Americans just reach out to Africa? Like, especially Burkina Faso, since like Burkina Faso is saying like, hey, you know what? Come on over. Like, so I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts, Peter, on like the Black fatigue and all this shit?
Well, I think it's related to just the Democratic Party not understanding what the future is because, we had a huge wave of activism with BLM. And if you think about like back in the 60s, the Democratic Party was able to incorporate the civil rights movement and basically create a Black political class that held, basically up until Obama. And that kind of, I don't know if it fulfilled their function, but there is a new wave of activists and organizers, and the Democratic Party tried to co-opt it, but they also, I feel like a lot of them were shut out, and I think, especially after the George Floyd protests and stuff, I think for our generation, it's just kind of like, well, we did everything we were told to do, so. I would say personally, I feel very, and I'm always working to become more like emotionally distant from the Democratic Party, and just
yes, same here.
Detaching, understanding that like I don't have any attachment to it, and it's going to do what it's going to do, and that's why I've been trying to sort of get more of a historical handle on it. And I do think for the people that are actually woke in what that term originally meant before the right turned it into a slur, I think there's a lot more inward focus and look at returning to Pan-Africanism, because ultimately like America, until there's reparations, like the fundamentals of institutional racism in the United States aren't going to change. So you might as well and also just the way, this is a pretty ossified political system. And I get, if you want to stick around and fight it out, I mean, that's kind of my thinking. But I also completely understand people who want to diversify their portfolio, I think, as I've said earlier. because at the very least, you know, having multiple passports is good if shit starts to go down, because, you know, once they're done with the immigrants, like, where are the Nazis going to come next? Like, so I guess that's probably my thinking on it. And so it is inspiring. It's one of those things where it's hard not to be like, oh, get your hopes up for then another coup to happen. You know, anytime there's something inspiring going on in Africa. But what I think is really interesting is that Traore is like really mobilizing the people and saying, like, you have to defend, you know, we're taking the steps for our own sovereignty, but the people have to defend it. And actually mobilizing the people of Burkina Faso in a way that, like, is pretty alien to, like, anything we understand about politics in the U.S.
Yeah, couple thoughts as you were talking. I was just thinking, like, actually connecting it to the Tuareg people and kind of like some music recommendations. Tina Rewin is a band, a Tuareg band, and there's a genre of music. I guess it's kind of loosely called African blues or desert blues, and a style of West African Sahelian music that basically is and sounds like a predecessor to blues music and rock and roll. But like many of those bands, like the older ones, the newer generation of those African blues bands are a little more exposed to Black American blues, like Black American rock and roll, stuff like that. But a lot of those bands like weren't, like, for example, Tina Rewin, they weren't exposed to Western music. So once they got their hands on electric guitars and started playing it, people were like, wait, that sounds like rock and roll. But when they weren't originally exposed to it. So it kind of raised this, like, people like, wait a minute, like, maybe blues and rock and roll originated in Africa, but how did it get to the U.S.? So, like, that book, Africa and the Blues by Gerhard Kubik, there's also, like, an interview he did where he basically, like, kind of lays out his the argument, what he found out, because essentially what he lays out, and actually he has a really good map, and essentially he traces the blues most characteristic traits to essentially, like, actually, yeah, like Burkina Faso, northern Nigeria, northern Togo, northern Benin, northern Ghana, northern Ivory Coast, and a little bit of, like, northern Guinea, and southern Mali, like that kind of, like, Sahel belt region that some of it actually does overlap with, like, countries like, for example, like Nigeria and Senegal. So, like, blues music as a sound versus just the name or how the genre is presented. Because I think when people think of blues music, they might think of, like, people like fucking Steven Seagal having, like, a blues band, like, you know, some white man being like, yeah, man, I really like the blues, you know. I'm here suffering, man. I'm just going to play the blues music. You know, especially, like, when white guys get fucking old, like, past the age of 50, they start like getting into, like, yeah, I want to listen to some Robert Johnson and Lightning Hopkins, man. Like, just really into the blues, man. This is the real music.
After their second marriage dissolves, they truly understand the pain of you know, the African struggle, the Black experience. They become one with it, and
yeah. So people think of blues music as that, when it's not. But the sound, because as a musician, I'm speaking of which, like, in a couple of weeks I have a showcase coming up. But as a musician, particularly as someone who plays West African drumming, like, the characteristics of Black music, Black American music, there's more to Black American music than just, like, the simple act of black people inventing genres and black people performing music. Because to me, it's like, that's self-evident. Like, yes, we can prove that, like, black people invented rock and roll and jazz and funk and hip-hop. But black American music is its own thing. It has a sound, a very distinct sound, that it does sound different than white people's music, but music that is not black or black American. And, like, there's a lot of characteristics that make music sound the way it does that, like, if one is a casual listener, they're probably not going to pick up on too much of that stuff. So, like, there are some very consistent characteristics with black American music. And in the case of blues music, like, the scale, it's often in, like, a 5-note scale, sometimes a 7-note scale. But there are these certain, like, flat notes that appear in blues music that give it a sound, like, usually in the flat 3rd, 5th, or 7th notes. And, like, in classical Western music, those are, like, notes you don't touch, typically. It's like, oh, we don't play that, you know? In their perspective, it sounds like demonic or whatever. But essentially, you would call them, now they're called, like, blue notes. So blue notes are also in jazz music as well, for those of you who like to nerd out on that stuff. So blue notes, those notes that sound like kind of like off or flat or like odd in a way that, like,
the tritone especially.
Yeah, and it's like, it's not supposed to be here, but it's there. But when you play it, it's like, whoa, right? That's what gives blues music the sound, right? So anyway, that sound originated in West Africa, because in the African music system, that's normal. That's what you would normally do. You would normally, especially with, like, if you listen to African musicians playing on, like, their own indigenous, particularly their string instruments, it's easier for them to bend the note because there's no frets. Actually, a lot of ethnic music, Arab and Indian music, they'll bend the note too, but it's in a different spot, and so it gives it a different sound. Like, I was watching this guy, he's an Indian guy, he's playing the sitar, and sometimes, you know, like, there'll, like, be these white guys who travel around the world. It's not always, like, corny or like, you know, they're just, like, curious. A lot of times these guys are just music nerds and shit. But I think it was a white guy who, he was into guitar, and he wanted to know, like, you know, the roots of where the guitar comes from. And actually, the modern Western guitar actually evolves from the Middle Eastern oud. That's where it comes from. So when the Muslims, you know, controlled North Africa and then Spain, the influence that they left over after the Muslims got kicked out was the oud. And over time, it evolved throughout the medieval period into the modern-day Western guitar. So, the oud, like, you have to play it differently, and, like, it's a different type of neck, and the tuning system's different. So, like, it has a very different sound that when you play it, it's like, oh, that sounds very Arab, or Eastern. You know what I mean? And then in the case of the sitar, you could actually literally move the fucking frets. Like, it's kind of cool. So anyway, my point is that, like, I can go on and on about that, but essentially, like, that is where, like, black American blues comes from. Okay, so how does it connect to, like, what's going on in the Sahel and even Burkina Faso, right? I think, like, African Americans, we have to think of ourselves, and other people have to think of black Americans as that, like, we're essentially, like, an Africa diaspora nation outside of Africa. Like, we're not just Africa in terms of, like, just blood and genetics. There are elements of African American culture that when you look at the roots, it does go back to Africa. Like, there are things that, yes, are westernized about African American culture because of the transatlantic slave trade. Like, for example, we're speaking English, right? We're not speaking indigenous African languages. And for the most part, most black diasporans, not just black Americans, but Jamaicans, Haitians, Afro-Brazilians, like, most black people whose ancestors were victims of the slave trade believe in some form of religion that is non-African, because, particularly Christianity, because of slavery, right? So there are elements of our identity and culture that were imposed on us because of enslavement. And there are things that were taken away from us because of enslavement. But there are things, despite enslavement, that we were able to keep from our ancestral homelands that, like, still make us an African descent people, despite, um, being kidnapped from our ancestral homeland via this transatlantic slave trade. And I think to me that adds even more fuel to the argument of, like, not just Pan-Africanism, but also to build stronger ties across the African diaspora and with the African continent, because Africa is where we come from. And if you look at the deeper roots of a lot of our culture, there are elements that come from Africa that, like, a lot of people in the diaspora aren't even aware of, right? Like, I know the stuff about blues and music because I'm a musician, but I'm pretty sure if I was to ask a Black American who's not a musician, they probably wouldn't know the extent of, like, the minute details that, like, this is what makes blues music sound the way it does, and this is how it goes back to Africa. Because, again, there are certain notes that the kind of, again, the sound and the aesthetics of Black music, for the most part, are African derived. If anything, what's Western about is, like, modern day recording technology, certain instruments, English language, but, like, but it's something I think we have to think about, like, especially when it comes to Pan-Africanism and even the idea of citizenship in a country like Burkina Faso, because, yeah, we are basically, like, I would say, a displaced African diaspora nation outside of Africa. So yeah, I just wanted to, like, kind of tie in some of the previous points, and then, like, the citizenship in Burkina Faso.
Yeah, to also bring in another example, I guess in the culinary direction, like, there's even, like, a lot of Southern cooking, quote unquote, is black cuisine, and you can see, like, if you, like, something like jambalaya, the similarities between that and something like jollof rice are very evident.
Yeah.
Once you kind of figure them out, or, like, okra is from Africa, sweet potatoes, and so, yeah, a lot of what is termed soul food, you can see the direct lineage. And I think the degree to which, Black America needs to maintain its own culture and its own identity, like, it has to still be tied back to the continent. And I do sort of understand, not like full on ADOS, but in the sense of, like, we've been here in this country, we deserve the right to be seen as Americans as much as anyone else, and
yeah,
built the country literally. And I don't think that it has to be one or the other. I think
right, yeah.
I think that, the ingenuity and creativity of the Black American cultural tradition shows that we can, do whatever we want, and that we can, use our experiences in America and tie them to what's going on the African continent to create our own cultural and political movements as we see fit for our own conditions. And so it shouldn't ever, it's a false trap to be like, are we Americans? Are we Africans?
Right.
Eventually we'll get to the Republic of New Africa, but the entire empire is going to have to collapse before there's an opening or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, but I still think that, that mindset of nationalism amongst Black people in America, in the United States, is worth developing for the future, because I think part of the reason that that Trump has made inroads is because there's internalized anti-Blackness and just the general erosion of all cultural traditions into the American cultural product machine. And I was watching I think Ill Bill last night. And he was breaking down the Kendrick Lamar halftime show, and I was like, even, which I enjoyed, but it really still wasn't that crazy, honestly, even compared to some of his earlier stuff. But there is still, I feel like so much even of the past 50 to 60 years has been lost, that it's like, I don't even know what the kids understand, the stuff we grew up with as this is Black history, Black History Month and everything like that. What we were taught, either in school or outside of school. I don't even know to what degree, like how much of that has transferred over, or, how they understand the Black Power movements, Kwame Ture, the Black Panthers, and all that stuff, unless they're like, super woke.
I actually have an answer to that. It's funny you asked that. I actually have an answer to that because I'm finishing up this long-term substitute teaching assignment this week, and for the teacher I'm subbing for, one of the classes is African American literature, and it's all seniors, and it's almost all Black students. There are some students who are not Black who are taking the class who just have a general interest. And we were reading, what did we? Oh, we read the book Kindred by Octavia Butler. Wait, Peter, have you read Octavia Butler or Kindred or any
I've not read Octavia Butler because I don't really read science fiction.
Oh, okay.
I feel bad about it.
I will say with Butler, at least with Kindred, that book is more like historical fiction, but there's elements of sci-fi fantasy in it. Basically, the book is about a Black woman who's in like her mid to late 20s, and she has a white husband in the late 70s, and she has these dreams where she gets taken back to the antebellum South, and she keeps having to rescue this young white boy who's like a teenager who's the son of a plantation owner, and it turns out that white kid is one of her distant ancestors because he this is a bonus episode, so I could probably say it. He, in the context of slavery, raped, had non-consensual sexual relations with one of his enslaved African women, and had a biracial child who is the protagonist's ancestor. So basically the book is fascinating, and I had a lot of students who were captivated by the book. And basically, like, one of the themes of the book is intergenerational trauma by slavery, and like the impact it has on black Americans. But one of the things I tried asking my students, I don't know how much they got about that or like what their interpretation was, but one thing that it made me think about is like, like how has slavery impacted white people in the U.S., right? So anyway, it was an interesting discussion in the book, and their main assignment throughout the year was to write an essay and a seminar and to discuss it, because there's a lot to fill in. Anyway, so Black students of, I would say, this younger generation of like high school students to college students, they are aware of slavery, but it kind of gets split up. At least in the seminar I had with them, it was interesting. There are some students who are like, I had one student who said like the only time she ever learned about real Black history was when there was a Black teacher in the room. And Black teachers in K through 12 are a minority. And if you're likely going to encounter a Black teacher in K through 12, you're more likely going to have a Black woman as a teacher versus a Black male, right? Black men as teachers, particularly in K through 12, Black men are the most underrepresented demographic in K through 12 faculty compared to every other demographic when you factor in race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. But still, for the most part, most of America's K through 12 faculty are white, particularly white women. K through 12 teaching is like, as a profession, it attracts like a lot of liberal do-gooder white women who are not always malicious, but that can come with like the pitfalls of being like a do-gooder white liberal, if that makes sense. So anyway, but then another student who like, she was already pretty conscious, but she basically said like she was sick of talking about slavery all the time. But one thing I've heard from students across the board, they're curious about African history before slavery. That's one thing I've noted. I have definitely noticed that, not just in that class, but other classes I've been in. I would say a lot of black students of just this generation. Again, this is purely anecdotal, but I'm pretty sure if you were to like pick the brains of a lot of like black students who are in K through 12 or even college, they would be very curious about African history before slavery. And also, I think they do want to know where African Americans come from. And I do think that's a very real question that, like, I think the ADOS FBA movement, they tackle that. Like, their answer to that kind of quagmire is like, we're not African at all. We're just like some homegrown American ethnic group. And then it gets into some weird Dane Calloway shit where like we're some indigenous copper-colored nation of people or whatever the fuck, which is, you can't even take that seriously. But that's also what happens, again, like when people aren't taught proper history, like they're going to get like fucking charlatans. Like, I know there are a lot of non-black people who follow Tariq Nasheed as like, you know, kind of like, because there's some like, you know, there's some curiosity with like some non-black people like, oh my god, what are these crazy black people looking at? Tariq Nasheed? Huh. Like, so there's some like weird kind of like, when there are white people who sort of parrot Tariq Nasheed's talking points and jest, part of me like looks at them with a side eye. But like, people like him get clout because real history is not being taught, right? And so what happens is that like fucking idiots like Tariq Nasheed and Dane Calloway wind up filling the void with their bullshit. But what I do think is true, that like a lot of black students are curious about where black Americans come from. And when I had them do an assignment on that, they were really interested just based on the responses. Like, they were really curious. They're like, wow, we didn't know this, basically. And in terms of like where black Americans are from, when you look at a map of Africa, when you, again, this is still, these borders are a product of the Berlin Conference, but if you were to stretch a line from modern day Senegal down to Angola, that is where African Americans come from. All those various dozens of ethnic groups from Western and Central Africa, that is where African Americans and all descendants of enslaved African people come from. And it kind of varies, but we're essentially an amalgamation of all those different ethnic groups into like, I mean, genetically speaking, we are kind of like a new African people, if you think about it. Like, we're not purely Yoruba. We're not purely Bakongo. We're not purely Kikuyu or Fulani. Like, again, our ancestry is a mix of all those African ethnic groups who survived the transatlantic slave trade, and whatever bits and pieces of their cultural knowledge that they had from their ancestral homelands, those bits and pieces that survived laid the foundation of what we call black culture of today. So yeah, I that is one thing I have noticed, that in my opinion, I don't think the K through 12 system does a good job of addressing that question, despite all like the kind of again, kind of like the liberal do-gooder shit, particularly post George Floyd, where it's like, we care about everybody, blah 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 blah, and then like the Trump approach is like, oh, fuck all that woke shit, fuck DEI, blah 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 blah. When like, obviously Trump's full of shit too. The anti-DEI stuff is, the anti-woke and anti-DEI stuff is full of shit. But at the same time, like the watered down liberal wokeism doesn't really help either, especially when it comes to Black history. I don't think it gets to the core of a lot of things. It definitely doesn't. It definitely doesn't again address the quagmire and the main question of where do Black Americans come from. But yeah, that'd be my answer. I've definitely noticed that like a lot of Black youth of today like are curious about where Black Americans come from, and to this day, I don't think like the majority of their K through 12 experiences fills in that gap for them. So, but it's not just the youth. I think a lot of Black adults don't even know it, like or like aren't fully aware of it because again, it's just something that America doesn't teach Black. It doesn't teach anybody shit. Even by non-Black students, I would say non-Black people are curious about that history too. I would argue that because I've definitely noticed it in that class, like by non-Black students. They were like, "Oh, whoa, we didn't know this either. This is interesting," right? So I do think that like Black Americans and Black diasporans, it's important to understand that about our history. But I do think people who are not Black would benefit by knowing that history as well, in my opinion. Because I do think that like having non-Black people understand that about Black people whose ancestors were enslaved, I think if they knew that stuff, I wouldn't say all of them, but I think for many of them, they would probably have a little bit more understanding and like maybe empathy in terms of like where we're coming from on a lot of things, because there are certain things about like the Black American experience. And you're right, Peter, by the way, you're 100% right that it's not really an either or in terms of are we African or are we American? I guess the way I would answer that is within the context of the United States, we're a distinct group altogether, which you're right. I do think that's where like the FBA ADOS thing like kind of comes from. But what I don't like about what I find disingenuous, this is the word, disingenuous about that cohort is that I don't think that they're acting in good faith. I think their main thing is like they just want to say fuck Black immigrants versus defining Black American culture on its own terms and protecting it. Because they'll say some of that stuff, but most of the energy, especially from like the Tariq Nasheed acolytes, is basically them saying like fuck Black immigrants. Like they just their whole thing is like fuck Africa and fuck Black immigrants, which I think is the entirely wrong approach. I think it's reactionary, and I wouldn't be surprised if like some of those people, I don't know, like had ties with the fucking deep state or whatever, because it sounds, some of this stuff they say sounds fucking fishy. I thought it
was that was Yvette Carnell and Foundation for American Immigrant
right yeah that's true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Carnell and Yvette Carnell was like on the board of some anti-immigrant group. So there you go. So yeah, that's
I mean, and that is the Republican Party's plan to peel off Black voters. It's certainly not to give us anything. It's to be like, and you know, I definitely see that mindset crop up sort of in the wild, I guess, like amongst coworkers or something, where it is just like, and I would say perhaps it's a little more pronounced like in a kitchen, because you know, there's usually some Black people, but there's also a lot of Mexicans and other Latinos. And so there is a cultural divide, obviously. And so I can understand just a little, like, you know, who are like, I guess, resentment or just feeling like, you know, maybe job insecurity or something, you know, that, I mean, which is always the plan under capitalism, to have different groups fight each other. And Black people have often been excluded from the labor struggles and the labor movement in the United States historically. So I get that, but it is also like, you know, you have to do the work to do the work. You do have to, like, we do have to have standards, and we do have to like understand who we are as a culture, and be able to define ourselves and not feed into this, because it's very easy. It feels good. But it, like, I feel like a lot of times a refrain I hear is like, why are we always focused on other people? We should be able to put ourselves first and focus on ourselves. And that's true. But it if it just comes from that, and not an actual analysis of history and material conditions, then it does leave you open to the kind of propaganda that sort of the ADOS movement is selling, because it is much easier to just close off, and just say, "Wah, we want," like, not like woe is us, but like we shouldn't have to care about anyone other than ourselves. But also, we're not actually doing national, like the actual project of nationalism requires an engagement with the diaspora. So you can't even do it, like whatever ADOS thinks they're doing or whatever. You can't even do it. So you just end up getting further assimilated is basically what happens.
Yeah, and for those who are perhaps like unaware, some of maybe terms like FBA ADOS may seem like inside baseball, but like FBA, Foundational Black Americans, ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, like FBA was created by Tariq Nasheed. ADOS is Yvette Carnell's baby, and like I think Tariq Nasheed basically stole Yvette Carnell's grift and created his own acronym, and the term FBA has become, I think, like gained more traction, and so I do think there's like some real like just petty grifting going on, and Tariq Nasheed is just like a just total grifter. I like to think of Tariq Nasheed as the Alex Jones of Black America. The only difference is that like Tariq Nasheed doesn't sell like supplements the way that Alex Jones does. But like I think any kind of community or anywhere, like you're gonna find people who are snake oil salesmen and charlatans and who are able to beguile and brainwash people who are just gullible and ignorant. And Tariq Nasheed is one of those people. And like another thing, this is the only other thing I want to mention. In addition, that's related to the overall theme of Africa. Like one thing I do get annoyed with is when people bring up the Congo as a gotcha on Palestine. So I've heard that a bit, and it does annoy me that like when you say like free Palestine, like it used to be, I don't know how much it's used now, but I've definitely heard it that like if you care about the genocide in Gaza, people are like, well, what about like the Congo, huh? And to me, I'm just like
any Zionist gives a fuck about that. Come on.
Like, and look, a lot of Americans in general are pretty ignorant about Africa, period, including people on the left liberal kind of side of the U.S. So, but one thing I will say, if people want to bring up the Congo, that I actually think is related to Black American identity and the diaspora and Pan-Africanism, again, in terms of where Black Americans are from in Africa, the Congo. So if you look at a map of Africa, if you look at the modern day Republic of Africa, the modern day DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and then northern Angola, that region was once the Kingdom of Congo. So hold on, I'm looking at my map again. Wait, sorry, let me. Okay, here we go. Yeah, okay. If you look at a map again, yeah, because there's again Senegal. So from West Africa, right? Again, where African Americans are from, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone. Part of my family tree traces back to Sierra Leone on my late mother's side. So my late mother, and then like her late mother, who was my late grandmother, like that side of my family traces back to Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire is the French name, but I don't know. I don't want to pronounce a French name. I'm sorry. I don't care. I
concur. I have to deal with enough French words at work that I don't want to do it now.
Yeah. Especially in the spirit of a podcast named after Thomas Sankara. I don't want to pronounce a French name. Anyway, so Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Republic of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the city of Kinshasa is in the DRC, but borders the Republic of Congo, and then northern Angola, right? So like the Republic of Congo, the modern day DRC, and then northern Angola, that was part of the Kingdom of the Congo. And there are the Bakongo people. The Congo was a major site of the transatlantic slave trade. Congo, Angola, and Nigeria, they were major sites of the transatlantic slave trade. And a lot of Africans who were kidnapped from those regions were sent pretty much all across the diaspora, from Brazil to the Caribbean to even North America. African Americans, we have more West African heritage and culture in our identity, particularly like the kind of Senegal, Gambia region, right around there. Like we have quite a bit of that. Like a lot of enslaved African people who came from modern day Senegal and Gambia, a lot of them did go to North America, but not all of them. But African Americans, like a lot of us have Nigerian ancestry. You don't even need to have every Black American do a DNA test. Like a lot of us have Nigerian ancestry because Nigeria again was a major slave trading port. So how's that connected to the Congo? Well, the infighting between ethnic groups during the slave trade, because the whole like Africans selling Africans, really what happened is that Europeans would give guns to ethnic groups in Africa, and then those guns were used to fight against rival African ethnic groups, and the losing side would become slaves, and then those slaves would be traded off to the Europeans. But even slavery in Africa was temporary. And again, like slavery in Africa, one of the main rules was like what happened in so many other parts of the world, whereas like it was if you were the side who lost a war, you became enslaved. That's what would happen. But it was usually temporary. It wasn't like a life-term thing, and it wasn't hereditary. In the U.S., slavery was permanent, it was hereditary, and it was based on race. None of those conditions existed in the U.S. None of those conditions only existed in the U.S. Let me rephrase that. Those conditions for slavery are primarily like a U.S. and Western thing. But those elements didn't exist in Africa. So, and so that created a lot of internal conflict in Africa, particularly in the Congo region. And I would argue that that is important to understand the current state of where the DRC is. To me, it's not enough to think of the root of the conflict as like, oh, we're all using smartphones and computers and we're enabling the conflict. It's like, no, that's not the root of it. The root of it goes back to the slave trade and the chaos that was done in result to get more and more slaves out of Africa. Because basically the Europeans intentionally sold more weapons in Africa so that they can get a steady supply of slave labor. Oftentimes, Africa didn't have a domestic slave market that satisfied European demands. So the Europeans had to instigate it through giving Africans guns to kill each other, giving African guns to kill rival ethnic groups. And so then there's a slave trade, and then obviously the King Leopold, Belgium colonizing the Congo, and then Patrice Lumumba's assassination and the, I think, damn near like 30-year reign of Mobutu Sese Seko, and then also the fallout from the Rwandan genocide in the 90s, and Paul Kagame arming and supporting rebel groups in the Eastern Congo, because basically as reprisals for the Rwandan genocide. And so, yeah, that's how I feel about the DRC, is that, like, I do think that to fully understand what's going on, you need to understand how the Congo was impacted by the transatlantic slave trade to get to the root of the problem. And I don't like it when people bring up the Congo like I don't like it when the Congo's brought up whenever Palestine is brought up. That's my issue. Like, these are both very important issues, but to use the Congo as like a gotcha on Palestine, like, I'm like, to me it's like, okay, like, is this because whoever's saying that really cares about what's going on in the Congo? Or maybe they're sympathetic but don't know everything about it? Like, so, and again, what I think is to fully appreciate and understand what's going on in the Congo, we gotta appreciate, like, how the Congo was impacted by the slave trade and how that shapes black people in the diaspora, because a lot of us do have, like, either Nigerian or Congolese ancestry. Obviously, Nigeria isn't, like, part of the war in the DRC, but still, like, that region, like, yeah. Anyway, that I had to get that off my chest.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I feel like that Zionist talking point, and it'll be brought up. I remember, I feel like I heard it a lot more in like 2014 with something else, or, I mean, Sudan.
Coney? Was it Coney?
Well, no, I think it would just be like, why don't you care about what's going on in Syria or Sudan or something?
Oh,
you know,
right.
I hate the term whataboutism, because the term whataboutism comes from Americans complaining about the Soviets always bringing up segregation. But yeah, I will say that, like, I agree that just framing the conflict in the Congo as, you know, just seeing the Congo as a giant mine, a pit to get minerals out of, is part of the problem. And actually understanding, which it is extremely complex and not something I claim to be an authority on, but every time I learn more about it, it, like, recontextualizes exactly how important it is to understanding, like, the history of colonialism and underdevelopment. And I just feel like, you know, it is the heart, and it is, like, almost everything you can see, everything you learn about the history of colonialism, you know, from, like, Walter Rodney and stuff, it's on, like, the starkest display in the DRC. And I do think that, like, you know, if there is ever a way for it to be stable and prosperous and peaceful, that changes the prospects of Pan-Africanism in the continent as a whole dramatically. And so it is always worth focusing on and, you know, trying to understand and, I guess, supporting, because it plays such an important role in the political and economic future of the continent.
Sorry. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, like I said, I'm sick of, like, when people bring up well, it's just like, I mean, tying it back to the whole spirit of this episode, people are generally ignorant about Africa as a whole, period. Because it is like, wait, Peter, remember, like, when we were in college, the thing that was fashionable for like liberals to show how humanitarian they were was to say how much they cared about the genocide in Sudan, in Darfur. Yeah, remember those days?
Yeah. Well, there's another one going on.
Yeah, that's true.
Where's that one at?
Yeah, because it's like, it's something I've noticed. Like when people bring up Africa, it's like, oh my god, I care so much. And it's like, no, you don't. Like, no, you fucking don't. And that's one thing I do want to emphasize more politically is understanding African Americans as an African descent people, and that what goes on in Africa impacts us, and having a more thorough understanding of Africa, the continent, and even like the nuances and differences, right? Because even like, okay, we could say Africa as a whole, like the continent, but even as we were talking about it, like there's regional and state differences. Like again, like with Northern Africa, it's not all quote unquote racially black in North Africa. There are black people in North Africa, but many of the indigenous Amazigh people in North Africa are not what you consider to be racially black. I do think, like, I believe, from what I understand, like when those people are in countries like France and parts of Europe, they're not considered white. So I think when people say like black and brown people in Europe, particularly like France, I think like when they say black and brown people, like in a French context, is usually like West African and North African immigrants, particularly like Algerians in France, or like West African immigrants in France, especially if they're from like a French-speaking former West African colony like Niger or Mali or Burkina Faso. But yeah, I really think that it's important to understand Africa, and also like even on top of that, it's important for the black diaspora to embrace our African heritage as a people and as a community. And it's more than just like as part of like, I guess you could say like some sort of internal healing thing. I think it's deeper than that. It's more to understand that understanding us as a nation of people and us as political subjects. So like to be engaged in politics, you have to understand yourself as a political subject, right? That you have political interests that are tied to the world around you. And this is Don. I mean, I'm just to expand on that further. To understand oneself as a political subject is to understand one's own history, where you come from, and how that shapes your perspective. Actually, this is maybe we can start wrapping up soon. But like, wait, Peter, did you hear about Glenn Loury? Or I don't know how much time you have, but like, you know, Glenn, the shit with Glenn Loury, Manhattan Institute. Did you hear about that shit? So he got shit canned from the Manhattan Institute for speaking out against Israel.
Oh yeah. Well, it's the Manhattan Institute. That's the number one think tank of neoliberalism. So
yeah, I heard an interview he did with Brianna Joy Gray on her it was a Bad Faith podcast. That's what it is. And like, one thing that struck me about it, and like, well, they're obviously on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but there is something I found a little bit frustrating when I was listening to it, that none of them really got into like, what does it mean to be black in America, and how does that shape black political interests. They kind of touched on that. Let me put it this way. Glenn Loury got his fucking wake up call, because people like Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, who I think John McWhorter, he's kind of like, huh? Like, what the fuck is his role? But it's basically John McWhorter. I think like his role is to kind of be like that sort of black commentator who's not extremely conservative, not extremely liberal, but he will talk about race, but not from like a pro-black perspective. But he's someone that you can have on both NPR and Fox News. Like, but he is not there to give like a pro-black perspective. That's another thing with a lot of black commentators. Like, I wouldn't even, like, they may be pro-black in terms of aesthetics, but they're not pro-black in terms of like what's the agenda for black people, like the long-term political agenda, and what's like the end goal for black people, like when it comes to liberation, like, right? So Glenn Lowry, he played that role where he was like the black commentator who would say like, yeah, well, the problem with black people is culture and blah 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 blah. He didn't want to blame white supremacy, systemic racism, yada yada yada, right? He was there to kind of like neutralize that sort of liberal talking point. Whereas Brianna Joy Gray, she her politics I've seen evolve, which is good, because I originally, like, when I first heard about her, I was like a little bit apprehensive on a lot of things that she said, but I've seen her evolve. But even she said, like, one thing she said that struck me was that I think in recent years for her, because she's like a Bernie Sanders social democrat, I would say like that's how her politics initially started, especially as being on the Bernie Sanders campaign. And then she would be like the black person on the left who would kind of neutralize the quote unquote, I guess, like woke liberals. So in a weird way, they both serve their function on opposite ends of the political spectrum, if that makes sense, right? Like, neither one of them were held up as like the person to give a pro-black perspective. So to hear them talk together, I thought it was interesting, but like disappointing at the same time. But I'm not saying this is like to shit on them, but more as like, okay, I could see like they're kind of coming around to certain things. Like, Brianna Joy Gray, she said like, what was it? I'm roughly paraphrasing. I could find the episode and put the link in the show notes for anyone who's curious to listen to the whole thing. But basically, she said in recent years that she's beginning to understand how being Black American shapes her politics. And I was like, oh, finally, now you get it. Like, and it is true. Like, if you're a political subject, your identity does matter in terms of how you understand politics. And being Black American is a unique ethnic and cultural identity that does shape one's politics, myself included, right? But for me, I'm more upfront about it. But with what I found kind of frustrating with both of them, the reason why I found it kind of maybe frustrating or disappointing is that like neither one of them really try to define what being Black American is and how that shapes politics. To me, it's like they just started to figure out like, oh, being black actually means something politically. For Brianna Joy Gray's part, like she's coming at it from a Bernie Sanders left position, whereas Glenn Lowry is coming at it from like a black conservative who got his fucking wake up call. and Brianna Joy Gray was throwing him shade because she was like, you know, these people are not your friends. And like that was kind of part of like the little back and forth between them. But neither one of them, like, I think really, in my opinion, did a good job of defining like what it means to be Black American. Like, it's more than just like our ancestors being enslaved, but as we've been talking about on this episode, like there is a real culture and ethnic identity around being Black American. And like, yes, despite us being in the US for a long time, and yes, it is true, like we do have a unique place in the US and that we do deserve rights here, and that like to be clear, I'm not arguing that every Black American moved to Africa immediately. So I want to make that clear. I'm not advocating that like all the nearly 40 million Black Americans just up and leave the U.S. and just go to Africa. Like, I'm not advocating for that.
That shit would be crazy, though.
It would be crazy. I mean, logistically, it would be a fucking nightmare. So, and it would. I actually think it would probably, if there's not, let's say, like, something I would advocate more that seems like more tangible is like more organized cross-cultural and trade relations between the African diaspora among itself and the African continent. I think that's something that is tangible and realistic. And once you kind of foster and strengthen those relations, it would be easier, I think, for people of the African diaspora that if they chose to go to Africa, they can go there and like have an easier time. Plus, I think it'd be easier then to culturally integrate into whatever country that they go to. So that's why I'm not in favor of like 40 million Black Americans leaving the U.S. and just bum rushing the coast in Africa. That would be like, that's no. I'm not advocating that. But at the same time, like, if we're in the diaspora, we still have to understand ourselves as an African descent people, and that fucking means something in terms of our culture and our politics. And that's what I found frustrating about the Glenn Lowry and Brianna Joy Gray interview. So that's why I was wondering, like, if you heard about him being shit canned from the Manhattan Institute.
I think I'd heard about it, and yeah, there's always more money on the right, but every Black person that goes on right wing media will eventually gets put in their place and figures out what their function is. I don't think there's any one that's like been on TV for that long. They always end up getting shown the door because they're useful for a time, and as long as they say exactly what they're told to say. As to sort of the larger point, yeah, it does seem that, and I feel like this is perhaps dialectically a product of Obama, in the sense that I just feel like growing up, someone like Tavis Smiley would speak to the idea of like a Black American political agenda, whatever its shortcomings or difficulties are, that there was that sense of a political identity, and after Obama and then BLM basically kind of, and in the wake of that, it does seem like there really isn't that conversation. That discourse does seem to have faded into either different camps or just picking a party. When I would say that, from the civil rights era through the 90s, it was not like, we've got to ride for the Democrats, y'all. Like, every conversation has to come back to, and that's why we got to vote for the Democrats. It was like, we're organizing in response to our own conditions and what's happening to us. And it does just very much seem like that has fallen by the wayside. And I don't necessarily know how to pick it up. I think that's kind of what we're trying to do in this podcast. But yeah, I think that's probably all I got to say. We can probably wrap it up.
Yeah, I think, that's probably a good note to end on. And because you mentioned Obama a couple times, I think Black America needs a new political direction post-Obama, because I think like that that sort of promise where, because so much of Black politics in the U.S., and I think it's an episode from years ago where I said Black politics is dead.
I think that was our first one.
Yeah, I think it was the first one. Yeah, it's holy shit. And fuck, that was 5 years ago. Holy shit. It's been a long time since we've been doing this. So much of Black politics has basically just been about black people just voting for the Democratic Party and going home. Pretty much. Like, if we're going to be honest, so much of black politics was, it wasn't about, because I do remember you mentioned Tavis Smiley. I'm like, man, feels so quaint compared to now. Like, I know he's still on radio and has his own thing, but looking back, that was like 20 years ago. Where he did try to have like some sort of black, like an actual black agenda. And I remember he would interview people like Kamala Harris and Barack Obama before they got really big. If anyone recalls, like, because there are some old videos, I believe Tavis Smiley, he would interview like black political, like kind of like up and coming black political leaders. And one thing I do admire about Smiley, that he wasn't just gonna cheerlead whatever black politician would come on his show. He would just ask them hard questions. He would just ask them questions, get to the root of things. But he never was like pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. Like, he was really, like, I think, in my opinion, probably a very good example of what it meant to be a black journalist, in terms of like a journalist and commentator who was independent from the political party and the two-party system. It was more focused on getting to the root of issues that impacted the black community, which I think is even more crucial today than when he was doing that. But I do remember, like, he was criticized by Black America for not getting on the Obama train. And in retrospect, some of those same people have now turned around and said, like, dang, we owe Tavis Smiley an apology, because it's clear that Obama didn't give a shit about black people. He didn't do anything for black people. And some of his early writings indicate some level of, like, pull your pants up contempt for black America. You know, like, some of the things Obama said in his writings sounded like fucking some Bill Cosby shit before Cosby got Me Too'd. Like, he was the pull your pants up person. Ironically, Cosby couldn't keep his own pants up. So, so I think, like, the ship has sailed on that whole relying on the Democratic Party to advance black people's political interests. And I think that's where we're at politically now. And, like, when people were, like, shitting on black men for not being enthusiastic about Kamala Harris and, like, there's something wrong with black men, you guys are all fucking stupid, blah, 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 blah. And assuming that, like, in 2024, black men would just vote for Trump because black men are stupid and they're just nothing but pookies and ray-rays who sag their pants and smoke weed and invest in crypto. Even though it turns out the majority of black men voted for Harris. But what they did miss out is that, like, there were a lot of black men who were like, okay, we've been voting for the Democratic Party, but what the hell have we gotten in return? Right? And I actually think that sentiment is not just black men who think that way. There are a lot of black women who feel that way as well. So I think the ship has sailed on, like, the whole black people voting for being the most loyal demographic for the Democratic Party. I think that, like, that sort of the whole black fatigue, I think, kind of speaks to that. But again, the question is where to go from here. And I think the solution is obviously Pan-Africanism and building ties with the diaspora in the African continent. And that doesn't mean we have to be like, oh, we don't care about other groups. Like, it doesn't mean, like, black people should just be like, yeah, we don't care about Latinos or Asians or blah, blah, any other demographic. Like, no, like, black people can still build coalition, right? But, you know, I do think coalitions fall apart when, like, one demographic puts in a lot of the legwork, right? So, but I do think coalitions function best is when there's a shared political agenda. So, you know, I think Pan-African socialism could work well with, you know, other groups of people and their agendas. we can work together for mutual interest. That's what coalition and solidarity is about. Working together for shared political interests. With the understanding that, like, hey, we're different. We're coming from different perspectives, but we have similar goals. So I think coalition have to be purely political for shared political and economic interests. But anyway, I can blabber on and on.
We're at 1:40 and my bladder is full. So.
Oh shit. Okay. All right. So yeah, that's the end of this podcast. Peter, you go take a piss. So thank you for patrons for supporting this podcast. SankarHours.org. I guess we can sign out, right? Ready to sign out?
Yeah.
Okay. Keep the faith.